So good morning, everybody. We will get into it. So welcome to May's Leaf Surgery, which you'll have noticed has now been suffered a rebrand as Leaf Digs Deeper. We felt that really illustrated what we do, try and deep dive into a particular subject. So we're really pleased you could join us. Thank you all for making the time on a Friday morning. And it gives me great pleasure, really, to welcome our speakers. So obviously, the environment around and the climate around plastics in farming is an ever-changing one. As we'll get into today, we know that plastics are necessary for an awful lot of things we do and an awful lot of environmentally positive things we do. But there's no doubt that there's increasing pressure on farmers and growers in how to handle that, not least from their own cost and economic perspective, and also the desire to lessen their environmental impact from their operations, but also from consumers and supply chains. And so we thought this was a really topical discussion to get into the weeds of. And we're very lucky to be joined by two speakers who have different areas of expertise in this. And hopefully we're able to explore that. So just a brief introduction to our two speakers. I'll allow them to do a little bit more of a detailed introduction. But we've got James Snell joining us. James and his family grow a range of soft fruit and have been a leaf demonstration farm since 2018 and leaf members since 95. So in terms of integrated farm management and being good ambassadors and exponents of that approach, then James and his family are brilliant, and it's great to have them join us today. And then Ian Creasy is CEO of APE, so Agriculture, Plastics, Environment, as well as being a arable farmer. And Ian is really able to look at what the options are, the end of use options, and what needs to happen to improve the situation there. So I think we will start off this morning by just handing over to our speakers to get a little bit more of a background on the angle you're coming from, maybe your experience in this sphere, and sort of what struck you about it. We'll start off with James. I know, James, you came back to the farm having had a career elsewhere, and so you have that quite unique position of coming with a sort of fresh set of eyes. But it'd be great to know a little bit more about what you do at home and maybe the angle you're coming at from the plastic perspective.
Thank you. Well, I suppose, hello everyone, I'm James, and particularly having come back to the business in more recent years, the thing that was particularly notable actually is as a soft fruit farm, as a form of horticulture within agriculture, we use a huge amount of plastic. And so at first, actually, that can be quite a daunting perspective at first glance. But actually, when you start to dive into the things that we use, there is a strong recyclable element, and also a lot of it is to do with end of life. But just to give a sort of brief top line view of the business as a whole, we are a soft fruit grower for the major retailers such as Tesco's, Lidl, Morrison's, etc. And a lot of our plastic objectives can actually be driven by them. Alternatively, also, we do not just conventional fruits, but we're also doing organic forms of production as well, such as black currants, red currants as well, and other such berries. The key, though, with mentioning that is that I will touch on it later, I'm sure, but actually plastic also plays a form within organic production as well. So as a farm, we have about 500 seasonal workers and produce predominantly through the summer months. We don't have any forms of heated production or glass house. And Anthony and Christine, who are my parents, set up Windmill Hill Fruits back in 1998, if that's correct, and serve my memory well. So yes, a bit about us, and maybe I'll pass at that point over to Ian.
Thank you, James. And already we've sort of touched on some elements that you'll bring to the discussion in terms of some of maybe the top-down pressures on you guys as growers as well, and how that might be driving the agenda. So we will definitely cover that. Ian, would you mind giving us a bit of a more detailed sort of intro on yourself, your background, and the angle of APE on this discussion as well?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dan. And good morning, everybody. So my name is Ian, as you gathered. I am, my father's been a sort of second or third generation farmer up in Lincolnshire. We are principally cereals based and a modest farm, I would say, in terms of size. I went away and did other things for about 25 years at my father's behest and came back to the farm, and at the same time got involved in environmental work. And in the last 3 years was asked to run an organization you've heard of called APE. Well, actually it's called Agriculture, Plastics, Environment, but everybody shortens it down to APE. This is an organization that exists in Europe, and we have a very singular focus, which is to help set up and drive agricultural plastics recycling in the markets we're operating in. And to give some dimension to that, in Europe, where APE is operating, we have recycling rates in the agricultural and horticultural space of upwards of 80%. And in some markets like Ireland, that's at about 95%. Compare that to the UK, and currently we're at a modest 25 to 30% at best of agricultural plastics that are then recycled. And that includes all of agriculture and horticulture. And I should say, to James's benefit, that horticulture is and growers are a higher level than that, but they're dragged down, if you like, as an average by other areas. So we have a long way to go. And APE's role is as a catalyst, if you will, to work with farmers, work with the industry, the plastics manufacturers, the retailers, and the retailers for agriculture, the merchants, and particularly with government, which I'm sure we'll get into, and figure out how we are going to really help farmers and growers increase recycling rates in the UK, because at 25 to 30%, it's a pretty modest return so far.
Thank you, Ian. There's some interesting stats in there, but some very promising stats as well, in terms of there's a lot of room to improve, certainly in a UK context, and we can see that other countries are doing a great job in there. So we'll explore that a little bit as well as we go through the discussion. I think a really good place to start is to get straight into the sort of potential controversy of it. And we see, as consumers, we can see the pressure on plastic packaging. We can go around our local retailers and see alternatives that are being offered. And sometimes these things are presented as a much more climate positive option. We'll talk more about the trade-offs in a minute. But if we were to consider the statement that plastic and sustainable farming, environmentally positive farming are mutually exclusive, I think we would know that that isn't the case, and actually plastics facilitate climate positive farming. And it'd be good to explore that a bit. So James, if we can start with you, how are plastics crucial in your business to actually make your operation more environmentally positive?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think the best example, actually, before we dive into the soft fruit, which is the sort of lion's share of the business, and actually maybe some of the discussion, is actually the organic production that we do with black currants. So black plastic is actually integral to the survival and production of blackcurrant plants. Essentially, the black plastic is laid in a row, and the blackcurrant is inserted within that. And the black plastic provides moisture control, ability to help the blackcurrant compete with the weeds by providing a blackout zone. So there's very limited weed growth around the blackcurrant as it's establishing. And I mean, the trade-off for most forms of production is if you're conventional, then the plant is competing with chemicals. But if it's organic, you're competing with weeds. And so the only way that we're able to do that currently as growers is through using black plastic, as strimmers can only get so close before they start to damage the plant material itself. So I would go as far as to say that blackcurrant production that's organic, it is totally integral to have black plastic involved. And so therefore then as a grower, it's more about, as I know we'll come on to in a bit, that end of life management of the black plastic. I mean, blackcurrants could be in the ground for 15 years before they have a mow down. And so in terms of managing the black plastic and careful management of it during those 15 years, and then actually how you dispose of it at the end is the crucial part to that. The second bit with the soft fruit production and polytunnels in particular, strawberry production now at commercial level across the UK, I would say is most likely 100% covered. Maybe there are some forms of unique niche organic soft fruit production that aren't, but the polytunnels where we use LDPE, which is low density polyethylene, it's 100% recyclable, and it provides a controlled environment for which we grow the soft fruit. If you look after it, it could last up to 10 years. If you don't look after it, maybe down to 5. But we do have some clear practices in terms of how to make that plastic last even longer, such as every year we skin the polytunnels, and by that I mean we roll them down to the side hoops. we cover them in a black plastic outer coating, and actually that cleans the plastic by killing any of the algae or bacteria that's on the plastic from the summer. And also it stops it from being, because we put ropes over the plastic to hold it down, it stops the plastic being broken down over the winter when there are storms, etc. So if you look after plastic, it can survive a lot longer. But the use of it is crucial because it provides that controlled environment. We're able to pick when it's raining. We've reduced mold and rots on the fruit when there's excessive humidity or rain. That actually can often be very damaging to soft fruit production. And also is great for pest and disease control as well, in terms of when we're putting biocontrol in the field and IPM management. It's a different game altogether from, if you go back maybe 20 years when we were soil grown strawberries with no polytunnel covering, we've seen maybe a 30–40% increase in yield. So it really has been a game changer for the industry as a whole.
Thanks, James. So several elements and several threads to that. One completely facilitates certain types of growing like organic, and then also reduces disease and pest pressure, therefore reducing the need for chemicals in some elements, and increases yield, and so dilutes some of those input costs in terms of finance and also the emission side of things. And you just to point out another bit that we'll pick up on in a bit, you talked about actually what farmers and growers can do in terms of lessening that impact. And one is looking after the plastics while it's in use. And if you get 10 years rather than 5 years out, you've already halved your problem at the end. Ian, have you got some elements to add to that and some examples of how actually plastic facilitates that climate positive farming?
Yeah, I would echo all that James has said. I mean, if you look at the broader agricultural context, so if you're a livestock farmer or indeed a cereals farmer, again, plastic plays a key role. And you cannot, I would go so far as to say you cannot really be a sustainable farmer, and we're all driving towards sustainability in farming, without the use of agricultural plastics. I mean, that's a straight fact, and there isn't really any easy alternatives that are either affordable or at a sufficient scale to replace plastic. So it comes down to the simple question that in a sustainable farming environment there, with the use of agricultural plastics, you have to have a sustainable end-of-life management of that plastic. Otherwise, the whole sustainability argument starts to crack. And it's the challenge of how do you look after plastic at the end of its life that, for me, is a particular focus. Recognizing that, for a lot of livestock farmers, plastic is a key part of their feed regime for the winter, whether it's silage bale wraps, silage sheeting for silage clamps, etc. You could just list and list and list how important the uses are of this, including what James has touched on in terms of water conservation, reduction of chemicals. There is a host of reasons, and therefore, to repeat the obvious, it's not so much can we replace the usage of it, but can we find solutions to the end-of-life management of it that are sustainable, that drive towards recycling, and indeed that provide a circular economy in the longer term for this plastic coming back into the agricultural sector.
Brilliant, thank you. So there's during life elements that we can take into account, and then end of life, and actually things beyond farm gate that can facilitate that as well. I think the other thing that's come out to me from that discussion is we need to be honest and transparent about the use of plastics in agriculture and where and how it brings those benefits, rather than simply looking at taking it out all the time. Because in doing that, we introduce some trade-offs, don't we? And I know, James, you have some really good examples of what that might be. So again, I'll come at it from a consumer perspective, going into a retailer and looking for soft fruits that may be presented in a paper packaging, a cardboard packaging, rather than a plastic packaging. The assumption perhaps being that is inherently better. But I know there are some trade-offs with that. And if you're maybe getting some top-down, pressure's maybe the wrong word, but encouragement to go down that route, or requirement to, that is not simple. Am I right in saying that there are actually some trade-offs there?
Completely, Dan. And actually, the paper solution is potentially the way forward, but it does have some serious flaws at first. in that the properties of a plastic punnet are advantageous in subtle forms, such as the lightweight aspect and also the way that the uniform punnet slips perfectly into the punnet below. And so as a direct consequence of that, with cardboard punnets not only being bulkier, but also being harder to store, that you can store one pallet of plastic punnet packaging will equate to 4 pallets of paper punnet packaging. So that also means when I'm receiving lorry loads by the week of packaging, I now have to, instead of receiving 1 lorry load of plastic punnets, you could actually receive 4 lorry loads of paper packaging. So it shows that there are other knock-on effects in terms of when you're doing carbon capture and the effects to the environment, that actually now you've got a lorry going 4 times. I need to have 4 times the storage space. And actually, when you have a plastic punnet, there is the subtlety. You can rip off a plastic film, and with a paper punnet, when you rip that off, because it's been hermetically sealed with paper, it actually rips the punnet apart. So our wastage of paper punnets has gone up. So there are some sort of areas to juggle there in terms of the benefits of going to paper. Paper punnets are also quite a lot more expensive. Some quoted 4 times more expensive as plastic punnets. And so then also the question has to be asked in a cost of living crisis, how affordable is the move to paper? Can people afford it? As and when the plastic tax really takes effect, or how a plastic tax could be used to make plastic sufficiently more expensive than paper, that actually paper then is the cheaper option. And then lastly, of course, the plastic punnet itself has been innovated. I know we'll maybe come on to innovations later, but the plastic punnet itself is actually 100% recyclable. It's only the film which makes up about 2% of the overall packaging product that actually has to be disposed of as single-use plastic. But the majority of the plastic punnet offering is 100% recyclable in residential homes.
And are those sort of nuances captured, James? If you were to do a sort of carbon audit, would the difference in terms of the paper cardboard packaging versus plastic in terms of storage, lorries for delivery and recyclability at the end of life, are those captured in those sorts of audits, or is that nuance lost?
No, that nuance is lost. I think there is a difficulty at the moment where the industry is yet to decide on an environmental carbon capture scheme. There are so many out there in terms of how you can measure your own sustainability that it's difficult to, no retailer has singled one out, or at least from a grower perspective, we're not being guided from that front. And so at the moment, I think it would help if there was some government guidance, some legislation, and actually potentially a government body that can actually run with this, and to be able to actually offer sufficient research, or maybe a think tank to actually assess the trade-off.
Brilliant, thank you. And that's a lovely sort of segue into levers for change, really. And just to interject at the minute, make this point, I can see a lot of people in our audience actually that have also a lot of experience with products and plastic use in production and in sort of packaging. And so we'll come on to some of the questions and points from the audience a little bit later, but I just noticed who we had in. Ian, feel free to move on to the levers and catalysts for change, unless you have anything to add in terms of those plastic alternatives and maybe some of the challenges they might present at an end-of-life perspective. James talked a little bit there about even at the consumer end, and so what is easily recyclable through domestic recycling. But is there more at a farm end as well, and challenges that are presented by some of the alternatives? And they could be biodegradable alternatives as well.
Well, just a couple of points, because I think levers for change is a really exciting area, but just a couple of other points. The plastics manufacturers, I think we could say they are very aware that, plastic, whilst being a very necessary part of agriculture, development needs to take place. So there's a lot of work going on in terms of how you, in plastic manufacture, reduce the volume of plastic. So that if, I'm taking a different example now, let's say silage bale, wrapped silage bales, the ability, because of the technology advance, to use maybe 4 or 5 layers on a bale maximum, as opposed to the old days when it'd be 6+, in order to create that environment whereby silage can be made inside a bale. So there is work going on there, but is there a replacement to that product? No, there is not. I mean, there are lots of innovations going on, whether it's using seaweed and things like that, which are and other forms of cellulose, which are all fine and fantastic. But to be realistic, they are not even close to being of an industrial scale, and the costs are through the roof. So I think the innovation area of reduction of plastic is going to be based around plastic manufacturers and other forms of innovation in that sector is more likely to be of impact to farming over the next 5 years or so, rather than anything more fundamental in terms of material differences. And the other thing I think I would like to say, and again, I think James touched on it with LDPE and polytunnels, is that the vast majority of agricultural plastic is recyclable. It is a resource as opposed to being a waste product. And I think there's a mental shift that we need to probably take as an industry to recognize that an awful lot of stuff that is littered around the yard or is chucked in a skip and sent to landfill actually has recyclable capability to it. And I think that's a really important area of thinking that we need to take forward as an industry, as we move. So those are just 2 points I'd make on that. In terms of levers and catalysts for change, wow, it's a big subject. I think the fundamental point I'd make to begin with, and this is something that APE is really trying to address with government, is that currently all the costs of recycling land on the doorstep or the yard of the farmer. And it's in the current economic climate, that's a real challenge, because whether we like it or not, recycling of plastics, whether it's agricultural plastics, industrial plastics, or household plastics, is expensive because it's heavy in energy use. And the UK is unfortunately one of the most expensive countries for energy costs, currently certainly in the European marketplace. So in terms of levers for helping this, I think there are 3 or 4 that I'd pull out. One is just awareness, as I've mentioned, that plastics can be recycled. That this stuff, when its end of life is complete, isn't just a waste product. It has recyclable capabilities to it. I think there's a real need to help the industry understand how to store plastic post-use. The vast majority of recycling is done on a weight basis, and if you just keep your plastic on a farm chucked in the corner of a yard and it gets wet, it gets more muck on it, stuff like that, you can double the weight in almost instantaneously, particularly with water and moisture. And that's just another cost that the farmer has to bear. So I think there's work to be done in how we store plastic, keeping it dry, keeping it segregated, ideally keeping it in the corner of an old shed that that isn't really used for normal production, so that you avoid muck getting on it. All the same rules really that you'd apply if you're a household. It's not dissimilar actually in terms of what we're trying to do as households. It's just on a grander scale. And fundamentally, and this is something we may get into, is working with government to get government support along the same lines as they're supporting sustainable farming through SFI in England or SFS in Wales, etc., to get government support to help farmers in managing the end of life of this plastic. And where that has happened in other markets, we have seen significant growth in recycling rates. And I'm not talking about government support in the way of paying for the whole of recycling, because that's unrealistic and wouldn't happen. But in terms of incentivization along the lines of SFI, etc., to support farming and the whole industry in the process of both getting plastic off farms and then getting it recycled. And there's a lot more I could talk about that, but that's probably enough for time being.
Brilliant, thank you, Ian. And there's a few sort of threads on there and a few things, contributions from the audience as well, in terms of adding to some of those points. So when we talked at the beginning of that section about some of the innovations and maybe the push for biodegradability, actually those things can be hard to retrieve. And so one of the innovations there that we've had made is plastics that are easy to retrieve, and then that flows into, and I know you'll have a thought on this, Ian, that then flows into some of how we handle the soil contaminated plastics. And actually probably at the consumer packaging end we have a few more solutions, but trying to produce something that is a resource that is as pure as it can be, and so reduce the cost associated with it, can be a challenge at the farm end.
Yeah,
I was
I'd like to
thinking
touch on biodegradability, or is this not the right moment, Dan? Biodegradable plastics is an innovation. There's no question about that. And in certain areas, that works really well. I mean, there are clearly usage cases which just simply don't work. Because silage bale wrap, for example, you absolutely have to have an airtight barrier which lasts for longer than just 3 or 6 months, and biodegradability by definition doesn't do that. The other challenge of biodegradability is microplastics in soils, and that is becoming an increasing issue that the industry is looking at. Not because it's necessarily an end factor of biodegradable plastics, but just because microplastics is an issue which we're all starting to become increasingly aware of. And there's a lot of work going on in terms of whether biodegradable plastics do have some of those residue issues. So I think it's about usage cases. It always is that, there are certain times where biodegradability works really well, and there are other times when biodegradable plastics potentially cause problems when they're biodegrading in terms of wind blowing and getting into rivers before they've degraded, etc. So this is not a single silver bullet that fixes the problem. I think there's a lot of nuance that's going to go into how we approach this going forward, and how we find different solutions for different areas of plastics use within the industry.
Yeah, I've certainly seen there isn't a single answer to all of the problem. And again, it's great to see some of the people who've been able to join us in the audience contributing. Ian, it's great to see you here as well. I know you've talked about some of the innovations you've made in this space as well, and actually cost being prohibitive in many ways at looking at alternatives to oil-based plastics. And we sort of talked a little bit, James, you talked about a plastic tax and whether that actually hikes up the cost of those materials versus alternatives, and it makes the alternatives cheaper rather than the alternatives being inherently cheaper. I mean, it's an incredibly complex sort of situation and complex market, with government intervention being one of the levers that may be pulled there. I'm just interested to know, in other countries where recycling rates are so much higher, what are they doing differently that perhaps the UK aren't doing? Is there different usage cases? Is there different handling? Is the industry post farm set up better to handle those?
Yeah, it's a little bit of all of that, unfortunately. So the 2 or 3 key things. Number one, in almost every successful market, and I will talk about that being something where you've got a 75% recycling rate or above, there is, by and large, a national collection scheme set up, so farmers can get their plastic off the farm, almost across the nation, without having some sort of postcode lottery, which exists a little bit in the UK. And that could be either having material picked up off farm, but almost always in the markets that are successful, the driving way of getting plastic off the farm is for the farmer to take it to a drop-off centre. So drop-off centres tend to be a much bigger piece of what goes on in Europe. The second thing is that in a lot of these markets, government has helped support the setup of these schemes to begin with. I'm not talking about a constant funding, but just to help get these schemes off the ground and get them going. There has been, government incentivization to do that. And then in some markets, and Ireland would be the most obvious, they have very straight legislation. So they've effectively legislated that farmers will recycle. They've achieved that by charging a levy on all the plastic that is sold into farm, pre-use, so that effectively a farmer is prepaying for the recycling costs when they buy the original plastic. So, of course, there's an incentive for them to get that plastic off the farm and recycled because they've effectively paid for it. So there are a number of different drivers. And I'll be honest, some of these markets in Europe have been going at it for 10 years or more. So they've built up the infrastructure. But by and large, it's an infrastructure system. It's some form of support. And a lot of information and education going through to the farmers to encourage the effective handling of the plastic on their farm. As I've mentioned, the sorting of the plastic on the farm into the different types so that it is more easily recyclable. And if you just combine all of those things together, you start to build momentum.
Thank you, Ian. And again, we're having some really good contributions from the audience there. A lot talking about some of the contamination there and how that adds to cost in terms of weight, and also the increasing cost of recycling. Like anything, that is going up year on year. And exactly as you said, Ian, and one of our other audience members made the point, that cost sits with the farmer. And then as a point that Bob made in the comments as well, is that cost sits with the farmer, and then the farmer is buying back those recycled products to use elsewhere as well. So it's sort of stacked. James, from a grower perspective, what do you think would be the big sort of enablers or areas of help that could happen in the next few years that would either decrease your plastic usage, that could be through increased longevity of plastics, or increase your recycling rates or cost of recycling?
I think within horticulture, a lot of it is just to do with better management of plastic. The point around end of life management that Ian raised, I completely echo. And actually, it seems a really obvious thing to say, but actually, as soon as you finished with any form of plastic, so when we've got to say 7 or 8 years with polythene changeover, or maybe we've made it to 10, when we've changed that over and we wrap it down and take it to the side part of the farm, management or quick disposal is the quick thing. So if you can recycle it there and then, that's great. But the worst case scenario, which was for a business we took over last year, another soft fruit grower, we found a corner of the farm where there had been some plastic from quite some time ago, and the organic matter that had built up within it actually trebled the weight of the matter itself. And the problem is with the cost of labor, where historically my parents would have sent in a small team to sort it, where you can then actually sell plastic, particularly polytunnel plastic, there is a small value to it. When you've got labour rates at £760 an hour in 2016 to £1271 in 2026, only 10 years later, that increase in cost puts a cost on terms of sorting waste for recycling and then anything that goes to landfill. And so now actually there is a huge cost burden if you don't manage plastic correctly at the end of its life. So it's a really obvious thing to say, but as Ian mentioned, things like storing it in a dry space, and actually getting rid of it quickly is actually my quick win. And actually what we as a mantra as a farm try now to deliver is that getting rid of it quickly, then it's not a problem. If you hold or sit on plastic that is suitable for recycling, then you need to get rid of it quickly. In terms of the future going forwards, I think, as Ian also mentioned, some support, whether it's from the local council. I know that previously in discussions with Ian, which he might touch on, there's actually, when money is collected with plastic levies, etc., it's not always the case that the money collected by the government is then used to actually support farmers in the disposal of that plastic, which seems crazy. That just goes into the broader Treasury budget for general spending. And so that money should really be directed towards farmers and helping us get it off farm. I mean, I would also maybe ask legislators, how much of a priority is it for them? I know in one of the comments, someone mentioned that actually in terms of plastic use by farm, it's not so much the shelf product, the end product that goes to the supermarket that's the issue, because residential homes are pretty good at sorting that. But actually, in terms of plastic objectives, we're being driven only by the retailers at the moment. We aren't seeing any form of body that are driving our on-farm production use. So retailers are driving us on the plastic that they see. They're not actually driving us on the plastic that's used in production. And we're not really seeing governmental bodies either driving us on a basis. It's really reliant on our own innovation as an industry, and to be honest, slightly reliant on the good faith of growers to properly manage plastic at end of life when it's at the end of its life.
Some points really well made there, James, I think, and what you've crystallised there is you're right that we know that the retail environment does actually drive an awful lot of change. We can see that in many respects, but actually, as we've discussed here, probably and I'll go out on a limb, probably the packaging element, the consumer element is not where our big problems lie. And actually, some of our big trade-offs are in there. So something that may be perceived as being better environmentally, for those reasons we discussed at the beginning, can actually be worse. It is the farm end where we have the challenges. And actually, looking at the comments, there is a huge amount of goodwill and a desire to do that better from farmers and growers. There isn't a willingness to gloss over that or do it badly, but there's a huge amount of challenges, not least the costs of it. And we've even had the point that actually the costs are becoming so challenging that it's uneconomical to recycle, and that's not a position that anybody wants to get into at all. It seems to me that one thread that keeps coming through is how we deal with some of that contamination, and whether that's contamination at field level storage. We've talked a little bit on the storage side of things there, but is there anything we could be sort of talking to other farmers about in terms of how we can reduce and deal with the contamination as things are coming immediately off field or immediately out of growing? And then is there sort of add on to that question, is there a way that we could be sharing knowledge and experiences a little bit better in this sort of area?
Well,
sorry, over to Ian.
Sorry, no, go for it, James. If you
go on in. Well, you're still green on my screen, so we'll go for you.
Okay. I was always wanting to say, I think James has touched on it. There is no question. I mean, we've got to be realistic. Agricultural plastics is being used in a environmentally or an environment which is by definition has water, moisture, dirt, organic matter as a fundamental part of what goes on. And a lot of the plastics used are geared towards that. So, in use, you have to use the plastic to the best of your ability as a farmer. A lot of it does come back down to the post-use storage of it, and not just leaving it in the corner of the yard until the end of the livestock in shed season, if you will, and when you're starting to turn them out onto the land and then thinking, right, I better sort out all this plastic. Because as James has said, you build up problems which are then very expensive to overcome because it's all about weight and contamination. So that's one piece, and that requires just, I think, constant information and support and help to farmers to understand how best to store and to recognize the importance of that, because a lot of farms I go and visit, hadn't really thought about that as a challenge. The other part is the cost, and there is no easy way around this cost issue without the industry overall, and I'm talking now about the recycling industry itself, also having the scale and the capacity to deal with agricultural plastics. I hate to say it, but all of these roads tend to lead back down towards government action to help support the overall recycling industry in the UK, and not just the agricultural plastics recycling, because it's all part of the same thing. And James, you touched on agricultural plastics, plastic packaging tax, and the money that the government gains from that runs back into the HMRC coffers and not back into recycling. And it's examples like that that we're working with government to try and change. And there is a willingness from government to figure out how we become more sustainable as a country. There is a very clear willingness towards driving the circular economy. And agricultural plastics plays a key and a quite public role in that. But have we found the right solutions exactly? No. But I'll leave with one thought, that we're running a trial with the Welsh government, with Natural Resources Wales in the whole of the south, basically the south of Wales, built around 4 key rivers there. And we are incentivizing farmers by reducing the collection costs of their plastic off farm, not by a huge amount of money, by about £30 a tonne. But even that modest amount of help has significantly increased plastics recycling in that area, and significantly increased getting the plastic off farm in that area, because farmers are, obviously they're getting some money back in their pockets for doing it, or their reduction in costs, but also recognizing that here is an example of where the industry is trying to work together to find solutions which currently are almost all landing on the farmer's doorstep. And so it can be done, and Europe is an example of it can be done. We just need to work much more collectively as an industry to find the right solutions, and we need government to engage in that, not pay for it, but engage in it.
Thank you, Ian. Good summary there. James, I know you had some thoughts.
It's a challenging one in terms of how we spread the word. I suppose as growers we do meet up actually, and particularly depending if you're in a cooperative, we're part of the Berry Gardens cooperative, so we've got, I think it's 27 growers, so we often meet as a group and discuss best practices in terms of plastic management. The key thing I always think about is that actually it sounds, I know I said this earlier, it sounds obvious, but it's just the delaying. If you delay the disposal of plastic or you don't manage it properly, it can turn into a real headache. And this one farm that we've been managing, we've now cleared the area of plastic, but we did it at a huge cost. And so we've done that as we made that decision in terms of financially, as it's the right thing to do. It's also near a church, it's near a footpath. And so there are other reasons to do it. And also you need the local community on side, because polytunnels sometimes can be, it's slightly controversial, but they're not the nicest to have right next to your house. And so there's a bit of buy-in with the local community in terms of proper management of plastic and making sure that you've got buy-in from the local community as well, and that you're managing your plastic correctly. And so there are other reasons for managing plastic in the right way, but the key thing about that is that relies on a business in times when financially the horticultural industry, with the cost of labor and the way the government changes are coming in, management of plastic is falling down in terms of, as a business, you're driven by cost. And at the moment, the way the labor cost is going, that's really driving our focus. And so actually, in terms of then plastic management, that is a knock-on consequential effect as such. And so my thought to leave you would be, if you are a soft fruit grower out there or a farmer of any sort, it's to dispose of your plastic quickly if you can, or store it in a dry space. I know that sounds obvious, but we haven't done that historically, and we did pay a small, well, quite a large price for doing it actually. So I would say if you've got plastic, put it in a dry space.
Thank you, James. And I think we all know examples of where maybe somebody has taken on a farm and they've had to deal with that huge mountain of plastic waste that's just been left. And you make a really good point that I think it extends out beyond plastic and recycling, about engaging the community as much as you can, and then understanding why you're doing things the way you are, and that actually the efforts you're making to do things better. And I think you then suddenly have a load of advocates in the local community that are able to, jump on the local Facebook group when they're criticising the pile of waste that you may be dealing with. So it's been a fantastic discussion. I know we've only really scratched the surface, as is often the case, but I really appreciate, James, Ian, your time as well, and the contributions from people who've attended in the audience as well. I know there's a huge amount of knowledge out there in the wider industry, and a desire to do things better as well. And so I think part of Leaf's role is to facilitate that knowledge exchange and to be able to disseminate people's experiences. I think in summary, we've got a fair few points there that actually plastic is an essential part of climate positive agriculture, and we need to be honest and transparent about that and try and convey that message to government, retailers and consumers. The on-farm bit remains challenging, and storage, handling, prompt recycling has come through massively, and also the need for a joined up approach. So as is so often the case, not everything in terms of solutions and costs sitting with the farmer, but bringing in government from a support, a legislation perspective, and understanding, and also facilitating some of the infrastructure that's necessary. And your final point there, James, which I totally understand about, actually, as financial pressures become harder and harder, these things tend to fall down the list of priorities. Where we end up there is actually the infrastructure that was around it also drops off. And so we find ourselves in a worse place than we did originally. So thank you, Ian. Thank you, James. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Our next Leaf Digs Deeper session is on the 12th of June. This one will be available on YouTube in a week or 10 days or so. But thank you all for joining. And yeah, I'll just ask Ian and James to stay on, but enjoy your weekend. Thank you all.